In terms of the current environment, I have to congratulate IAB for their foresight in having a seminar that's focused on privacy, very critical issue indeed. So my focus today is in terms of how you can meet privacy expectations of both consumers and regulators, a very timely topic given recent events. So, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica story has been in the headlines for a number of weeks and has brought the issue of corporate social responsibility as it relates to privacy protection to the fore. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg has been quoted as saying, "We didn't have a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a huge mistake." Regardless of whether or not breaches of Australian privacy law are found to occurred or not, these events are really an opportunity for all businesses to consider whether their handling of personal information is not only compliant but is consistent with community expectations. And it's important that business takes this opportunity to ensure the benefits of data innovation to the community and to the economy can be realised. Businesses need to treat the data as trusted custodians of personal information of Australians. This is not only a legal imperative and a business imperative, there's a compelling case, I think, for businesses entrusted with the personal information of Australians to be ethical stewards of that information. There's also been a number of developments both internationally and domestically that VJ has alluded to, and they have brought privacy into sharp focus. These developments are about ensuring transparency, choice and control and accountability. So I'm going to start with an overview of these developments in the domestic and the international regulatory environment before turning in a little bit more detail to the principles in the Privacy Act that underlie the community's expectations for how their personal information is handled. And importantly, I'd like to point you to some practical resources that the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has available to you to help both meet your compliance obligations but also the community's expectations. So let's start with security of personal information. So fundamental to trust in the digital economy is the security of personal information. And on the 22nd of February this year, the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme came into operation in Australia, formalising data breach notification and assessment obligations for the range of agencies and organisations with personal information security obligations under the Privacy Act. And this morning, the OAIC has published its first quarterly report on the data breach notifications received by the Office. We've received 63 notifications since the scheme commenced, which compared with the 114 voluntary notifications we received last financial year, shows that we are on track for a significant increase in notifications received by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. You can find the full quarterly report on the OAIC's website this morning, but I'll give you a couple of the highlights. So of the data breaches that we were notified of, 51% were reportedly caused by human error. And we know that human error is a known risk to privacy, and it's one that needs to be mitigated against. That was followed by 44% of breaches reported to be the result of malicious or criminal attack and 3% as a result of system failures. The top three sectors that reported breaches to the OAIC were health service providers, followed by legal, accounting and management services and finance. 59% of data breaches reported that the personal information of between 1 and 9 of individuals were affected, and 90% related to breaches involving the personal information of less than 1,000. Of the remaining 10%, 5% of those involved the personal information of between 1,000 and less than 10,000 individuals, and 5% involved the personal information between 10,000 and less than 100,000 individuals. So these notifications will support improved understanding of the trends in eligible data breaches across industries and also promote a proactive approach to securing personal information and addressing security risks. So similar notifiable data breaches schemes can be found in other jurisdictions across the Asia Pacific, in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And from the 25th of May, the General Data Protection Regulation will harmonise the laws across Europe, and it will bring in place a notifiable data breaches scheme across the EU. So the GDPR provides significant focus on privacy governance at an international level, with the requirements extending to businesses that have an establishment in the EU, offer goods and services in the EU, or monitor behaviour of individuals in the EU. It introduces a number of new requirements, many of which are already reflected in Australian privacy law. At a high level, some of the key similarities are that both laws foster at their heart transparent information handling practices and business accountability to give individuals confidence that their privacy is being protected. Both laws also require businesses to implement strategies that ensure they comply with the laws and that they take a privacy by design approach, so integrating privacy protections in all new projects involving personal information handling where there is a high risk to privacy. There's mandated privacy impact assessments, and that's an expectation under Australian privacy law. And both laws are technologically neutral, which will allow them to apply in a range of different settings and develop over time. And complementing the GDPR, the proposed regulation on privacy and electronic communications, known as the e-privacy regulation, will update and repeal the existing e-privacy directive to increase the protection of people's private life with a focus on electronic communications. So the proposed e-privacy regulation would expand the existing directive in relation to that subject matter from the remit that currently covers telecommunications to a broader coverage of all electronic communication providers and includes updated rules for electronic marketing and for cookies. Turning back to the domestic situation in Australia, and Vijay mentioned the new consumer data right. So this has some alliances with the GDPR's right to data portability in the EU. So we're going to see more changes in relation to data governance in Australia as a result of the implementation of the new consumer data right, which will first be rolled out in the finance sector. And you'll remember that this new right was a central recommendation from the Productivity Commission's report on data availability and use. That report came out in 2017 and it sought to enhance data mobility in order to derive the economic benefits of increased competition across industries. So the consumer data right will give customers a right to direct that their data be shared with others they trust so that they can benefit from its value. And in terms of how that will be implemented, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission will be the regulator promoting competition and customer-focused outcomes through the consumer data right. And the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner will work to ensure that strong privacy protections are fundamental in the design and implementation of the consumer data right as it is applied across industry sectors. So let's turn to focus a little more on consumer privacy concerns and expectations. So while these regulatory changes are substantial in various ways, in reality, they do respond to enduring community concerns and a broad objective to ensure the community benefits from increasing data capabilities, using personal information in a way that ensures it's respected and protected. In our long-running national community attitudes to privacy surveys, we've consistently found that about 3 in 5 Australians have avoided a business due to privacy concerns. In our 2017 survey, 69% of Australians said they were more concerned about their online privacy than they were 5 years ago. And especially significant is that when it comes to the secondary use of personal information, such as, for example, where an organisation purchases customers' data from another for direct marketing, 86% of people perceived that as a misuse of personal information. And we can all recall various instances in recent years where organisations' trustworthiness has been publicly scrutinised as a result of perceived privacy risks or the failure to act promptly to respond to privacy risks. When consumer trust is lacking, it hinders an organisation's ability to develop a social licence for innovative use of data and undercuts efforts to improve data mobility and analysis, two key ingredients to utilising the potential uses of data. So let's talk about the principles underlying a culture of privacy and how you can meet communities' expectations. In today's environment, where data is effectively the lifeblood of various business operations, privacy must be integrated throughout an organisation. Fostering a privacy culture which extends from the collection of personal information right through its life cycle to its eventual deletion can ensure you are quickly able to respond to privacy risks. So how do you go about supporting such a privacy culture in today's data-driven world? The Privacy Act specifies that personal information collected by businesses must be reasonably necessary for its functions and activities. In relation to collecting sensitive information, there's particular protections under the Privacy Act that apply to that subsection of information. For example, our health information, racial origin, political opinions. Generally, there's an additional requirement for consent in order to collect that kind of information. And let's remember that collection must also be by lawful and fair means. These are foundational principles that must be considered. And the Privacy Act is also about ensuring transparency and about accountability. Transparency enables individuals to make informed choices about the sharing of their personal information and to exercise control. And transparency also ensures that organisations are held accountable when and if things do go wrong. And the Notifiable Data Breaches scheme codifies that long-held community expectation along those lines. Our Community Attitudes to Privacy survey in 2017 found 94% of people said they should be told if a business loses their information. Notifying individuals when they're at likely risk of serious harm provides them with a chance to protect themselves. And importantly, the Notifiable Data Breaches scheme reinforces that businesses have a responsibility to customers, not only to protect their information, but to be clear to them about what happens to their information that they are entrusted with. And when understood in this way, I think it's clear why a business can face significant public backlash if it appears to have concealed or attempted to conceal a data breach. While on the other hand, prompt notification can reduce reputational impact of a breach by demonstrating that an organisation takes their role as the steward of data seriously. And I think understanding that privacy is also about transparency and accountability clarifies the apparent disjuncture between Australians voicing concerns about their privacy and their willingness to share personal information in an online environment. The view that personal information is traded with an organisation and that the individual cedes any say in how that information should be handled doesn't align with community expectations nor the requirements of the Privacy Act. So, the question that each organisation must ask is how do the principles of transparency and accountability work in practice and how can we best meet them? So let's look at privacy principles in practice. One essential and enduring consideration is how you communicate with your customers about privacy. The hallmark of privacy is about transparency, and as part of this, you must have a clearly expressed and up-to-date privacy policy and privacy notices. Your privacy notices should be a communication tool, not a litigation tool. It's an opportunity to explain how you handle personal information to consumers in a way that's easy to understand and is also fair. Many businesses can indeed do better on this front. People need clarity on how you're handling their personal information. And this needs to be presented in innovative ways, and business is good at innovation, we know that. So point in time, transaction-specific notifications, layered information that's highlighting the points that are of most importance to consumers needs to be at the forefront, and then linking through to a privacy policy that's easy to understand and easy to find. These are simple tools, they can be effective tools. And it'll also support your compliance obligations with respect to consumer, attaining customers' consent, and help you to ensure that the information that you're collecting is done so fairly. So consent has regained some renewed focus with the GDPR. It expands on the previous definition of consent in the European Data Protection Directive to include the requirement that an individual's consent be clear and unambiguous. It needs to be an unambiguous indication of the person's wishes and provide a statement by clear and affirmative action. Consent's also relevant to a number of the Australian privacy principles in the Privacy Act. Those dealing with sensitive information, use and disclosure, direct marketing and cross-border disclosure of personal information. And under APP 6, for example, which deals with use and disclosure, a regulated organisation must not use or disclose personal information for a purpose other than the primary purpose that it was collected for, unless an individual consents or there's another exception that will permit that secondary use. And I also wanted to briefly touch on Australian Privacy Principle 7 that relates to direct marketing. Under that principle, again, consent is needed for direct marketing that uses or discloses sensitive information, such as health information, religious beliefs, political opinions, trade union membership, sexual orientation. Personal information other than sensitive information may only be used for direct marketing if other requirements are met. And you'll be familiar with the requirements to provide a simple way for individuals to request not to receive direct marketing communications or opt out. And this again highlights how central transparency and clear communication is to privacy compliance. And those of us who are up early this morning listening to the testimony from the US will know that this issue of opt-in or opt-out is a central issue of discussion at present, and that we need to be mindful of that and looking to potential legislative developments overseas and how we might apply the principles in the Australian context. But of course, all of this needs to be backed up by robust governance internally in your organisations that effectively identifies and manages privacy risks. Privacy has to be a high-order concern for your organisations. It needs to be on the agenda of the CEO, and it needs to have someone senior in the organisation who's accountable. In terms of how you can achieve all of this, so the OIC has a range of guidance to assist you. Our website is full of information around how to take a privacy by design approach. I'd like particularly to draw your attention to new guidance that we've published, a guide to data analytics and the Australian privacy principles. Data analytics, as we know, is increasingly prevalent across organisations and highly valuable in meeting consumer needs. But it also does present unique privacy challenges, including the ability to draw inferences and to create new personal information. Data analytics has the potential to reveal more about a person that they've chosen to share. It might reveal their political beliefs. It might reveal their philosophical beliefs or opinions. So our guide to data analytics provides some strategies to manage potential privacy risks in this regard. The critical strategy is taking a privacy by design approach. a requirement of both the Privacy Act and the GDPR. And this term, privacy by design, is talking about taking a holistic approach where privacy is integrated and embedded in an organisation's systems and processes, not bolted on afterwards. An essential tool for embedding privacy by design is conducting privacy impact assessments. A privacy impact assessment is a tool which addresses privacy risks at the start of a new project or way of dealing with personal information. It systematically assesses the privacy impacts of a project and recommends strategies to minimise or eliminate those impacts entirely. Secondly, it's also important, and particularly in your environment, where the line between dealing with personal information and de-identified information is one that I'm sure you're very live to. It's important to consider whether or not personal information is required to be dealt with in all situations, or whether de-identified information will suffice. And that process involves, as you know, more than removing names and addresses. It involves removing particularly unique identifiers, obfuscating, ensuring the risk of re-identification is minimised, putting in controls such as legal, contractual, environmental controls as to who can access the data. And it's not always possible to draw a bright line between what is personal information and what's de-identified. It's a risk management exercise rather than an exact science. But for information to be considered de-identified and therefore not subject to the Privacy Act, the risk of re-identification in the context needs to be exceptionally low. So for further guidance on this, we've published an in-depth guide to de-identification decision-making framework. It's a joint publication of the OAIC and the CSRIO Data 61. It provides operational advice on de-identification, and we've also got a user-friendly, simplified guide, De-Identification and the Privacy Act, together with guidance on e-learning, on privacy impact assessments, and how to conduct privacy by design in your organisation.